We received a question to our Tip of the Week email asking us to discuss the importance of the interest rate that the buyer submits on the third-party financing addendum. Traditionally, the interest rate has always been a contingency in favor of the buyer. Let's discuss contingencies generally. A contingency in your purchase contract is a provision that allows the buyer to terminate the contract if the terms of the provision are not met. Sellers love contracts without contingencies, i.e., with as little outs as possible for the buyer. While on the other hand, buyers love any and all contingencies a seller is willing to accept. During COVID, most of the winning contracts had very few, if any, contingencies. Now, with the slightly slower market, buyers are circling back to writing contracts with contingencies. Even more so with the change in the new contracts, which Dawn has discussed in the prior week's podcast, buyers have to outline their loan terms, which have always been contingencies, in their contract. If a buyer is getting a loan, they will have to disclose that in the contract and attach the third-party financing addendum to their contract. When a buyer attaches a third-party financing addendum to their contract, the buyer is asking the seller to agree to certain financing terms and contingencies. For example, under paragraph 1A, which is the conventional financing provision, the buyer and seller must agree to the loan amount, number of years of the loan, interest rate, and number of years of the interest rate, and origination charges that the buyer intends, or at least desires, to get. Then, if you go to paragraph 2A of the addendum, the buyer and seller must agree to whether or not the contract is subject to buyer approval. Buyer approval is deemed to have been obtained when 1. The terms of the loans described above are available, and 2. Lender determines the buyer has satisfied all of the lender's requirements related to buyer's assets, income, and credit history. If it is subject to buyer approval and the buyer cannot obtain this approval, the buyer must give the seller written notice of their inability to get approval within the negotiated amount of days after the effective date of the contract. If the notice is given by the buyer, the contract will terminate and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. In other words, if the buyer does not get the terms they outlined in their type of financing, then they can terminate the contract. If buyer wrote the contract contingent on receiving a conventional loan at an interest rate no longer available in the market, then the buyer has the right to terminate the contract under buyer approval. Under current market conditions, interest rates are fluctuating and mostly rising. To protect a seller from a buyer who is otherwise qualified for their loan from terminating a contract simply because the interest rate is no longer available, the interest rate in the third-party financing addendum should be as high as the buyer is willing to accept. The buyer can always close on a lesser rate. To protect a buyer, the interest rate in the addendum should be as low as buyer can get away with. It is a contingency in favor of the buyer. Buyer can always close with a higher rate if he so chooses, but buyer has an out if the interest rate is no longer available. The terms of the loan in the third-party financing addendum should be carefully reviewed by both the seller and the buyer, as would any other contingency written in the contract. Remember that although these contingencies may allow the buyer to terminate the contract, the seller needs to look hard at the terms of the contingencies to make sure that they are realistic in the current market that both the buyer and the seller are negotiating in. If you have any more tips that you would like us to discuss, please email us at tipoftheweek@allegiancetitle.com. We love being your resource for results here and at the closing table. Thank you.